What happens when Hollywood's most beloved action hero comes face-to-face with late-night television's most controversial host? You won't believe what unfolds when Harrison Ford sits down for what was supposed to be a routine interview promoting his latest project, only to find himself in the middle of a verbal battlefield that would leave audiences stunned and social media exploding with outrage. Before we get into this incredible story, make sure you hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below, because you're not going to believe what unfolds when two Hollywood titans clash in the most explosive confrontation late-night television has ever witnessed. The atmosphere in Studio 6A was electric as Harrison Ford made his entrance to thunderous applause. The legendary actor, known for his iconic roles as Han Solo and Indiana Jones, walked onto the set with his characteristic stoic demeanor, acknowledging the crowd with a subtle nod before settling into the guest chair. What nobody in that audience could have predicted was that they were about to witness one of the most uncomfortable and heated exchanges in talk show history. Jimmy Kimmel emerged from behind his desk with an unusually smug expression, his trademark grin seeming more sinister than welcoming. The host had been under fire recently for his increasingly confrontational interview style, and critics had been questioning whether his provocative approach was crossing ethical boundaries. Tonight, those concerns would prove prophetic, as Kimmel prepared to push one of Hollywood's most respected figures to his absolute breaking point. "Harrison Ford, everybody," Kimmel announced, his voice carrying an undertone that suggested this wouldn't be the typical promotional interview. "The man who's been dodging bullets and melting faces for decades. Though I have to say, Harrison, you're looking pretty good for someone who's been in the business as long as you have." Ford's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but his response remained measured. "Well, Jimmy, I suppose that's one way to start an interview. Thank you for having me on the show." The veteran actor had agreed to appear on the program to discuss his involvement in several upcoming environmental documentaries, a cause that had become increasingly important to him in recent years. What he hadn't anticipated was walking into what felt more like an ambush than an interview. Kimmel leaned back in his chair, his posture radiating false casualness. "So, Harrison, let's talk about your latest passion project. You've become quite the environmental activist lately. Some might say it's a bit hypocritical, considering you've spent your career making movies that probably have a pretty hefty carbon footprint. Flying around in private jets for movie premieres, all those explosions and car chases. How do you reconcile that with your newfound eco-warrior status?" The question hung in the air like a loaded weapon. Ford's eyes narrowed slightly, and for a moment the studio fell silent except for the low hum of cameras and equipment. The audience seemed to sense that something was shifting, that this wasn't going to be the light-hearted celebrity chat they had expected. "That's an interesting way to frame it, Jimmy," Ford replied, his voice maintaining its trademark gravelly calm, though there was steel beneath the surface. The entertainment industry, like many industries, has had to evolve and become more conscious of its environmental impact. The projects I'm involved with now are specifically designed to raise awareness about climate change and conservation. I fail to see the hypocrisy in using whatever platform I have to address what I believe is the most critical issue facing our planet. Kimmel wasn't backing down. If anything, Ford's dignified response seemed to embolden him. "But come on, Harrison. You're worth hundreds of millions of dollars. You own multiple homes, fly private jets, and live a lifestyle that most people could never dream of. Don't you think it's a little rich, pun intended, for you to be lecturing regular folks about their carbon footprint when you probably produce more emissions in a month than most families do in a year?" The tension in the studio was becoming palpable. Audience members began shifting uncomfortably in their seats, sensing that they were witnessing something that went far beyond typical late-night banter. Ford's publicist, seated in the wings, was visibly agitated, repeatedly checking her phone and whispering urgently to other members of Ford's team. Ford leaned forward slightly, his famous composure beginning to show cracks. "Jimmy, I think you're missing the point entirely. This isn't about lecturing anyone. It's about using whatever influence I might have to highlight scientific research and conservation efforts that are desperately underfunded and overlooked. If you have a problem with wealth disparity or lifestyle choices, that's a different conversation entirely, but don't disguise it as environmental concern. Oh, I see, Kimmel replied, his tone dripping with mock understanding. So when you fly your private jet to climate conferences, that's different from when regular people drive their cars to work. Got it. The rules don't apply to Harrison Ford because he's trying to save the world. The audience was now completely silent, the usual energy of a live taping replaced by an uncomfortable tension that seemed to permeate every corner of the studio. Ford's hands, which had been resting casually on the arms of his chair, were now gripping them tightly, his knuckles showing white beneath his weathered skin. "You know what, Jimmy?" Ford said, his voice dropping to a dangerous quiet that anyone who had seen his movies would recognize as a warning sign. "I came here tonight because I thought we could have a productive conversation about some important issues, but it's becoming clear that you're more interested in cheap shots and gotcha moments than actual dialogue." Kimmel sensed blood in the water and pressed harder. "Cheap shots? I'm just asking the questions that I think a lot of people are wondering about. You can't expect to put yourself out there as this environmental crusader and not expect some scrutiny, especially when your own lifestyle seems to contradict everything you're preaching about." As the confrontation reached this boiling point, it became clear that both men had crossed a line from which there might be no return, setting the stage for an explosion that would shake the very foundations of late-night television. The studio. Lights seemed to burn hotter as Ford slowly rose from his chair, his towering frame casting a shadow across Kimmel's desk. The legendary actor's face had transformed from its usual stoic expression into something far more menacing, reminiscent of the intense characters he'd portrayed on screen for decades. But this wasn't acting. This was raw, unfiltered anger from a man who had clearly reached his breaking point. "Let me tell you something, Jimmy," Ford said, his voice now carrying the full weight of his years in Hollywood and the authority that came with being one of the industry's most respected figures. "I've been in this business for over 50 years. I've worked with some of the most brilliant directors, writers, and actors this industry has ever produced. And in all that time, I've never encountered someone so willing to sacrifice basic human decency for a few cheap laughs and viral moments." Kimmel's smugness faltered for just a moment, but his ego wouldn't let him back down. The host had built his career on pushing boundaries and creating controversy, and he wasn't about to let Harrison Ford, no matter how legendary, make him look weak in front of his own audience. "Oh, so now I'm the bad guy for asking tough questions. This is exactly the kind of elitist attitude that people are sick of, Harrison. You think because you're a movie star, you're above being questioned about your contradictions?" The accusation of elitism struck a nerve that Ford hadn't expected. Having grown up in a working-class family in Chicago, he had always prided himself on staying grounded despite his fame and fortune. His hands began to shake slightly, not from fear, but from the sheer effort of containing his rage. "Elitist?" Ford repeated, his voice now barely controlled. "You want to talk about elitism, Jimmy? You sit here night after night making millions of dollars by mocking and humiliating guests who come on your show in good faith. You turn human beings into punchlines for your own entertainment and profit. If anyone in this room is an elitist, it's the man who thinks he has the right to ambush and attack anyone who doesn't fit his narrow worldview." The audience was now completely silent, many looking around nervously as if searching for exits. This had gone far beyond uncomfortable. It was becoming genuinely frightening. The cameras continued rolling, capturing every moment of what was quickly becoming the most explosive confrontation in late-night television history. Kimmel stood up behind his desk, his face flushed with anger and embarrassment. "You know what, Harrison? Maybe you should have stayed retired, because clearly you can't handle being challenged anymore. You're just another washed-up actor trying to stay relevant by jumping on whatever cause is trendy." The insult about being washed up was the final straw. Ford's composure, which had been hanging by a thread, finally snapped completely. "Washed up?" he roared, his voice echoing through the studio with such force that several audience members visibly flinched. "I've been making movies since before you were old enough to hold a microphone. You pathetic excuse for a comedian. And I'll still be making movies long after people forget your name." "Oh, really?" Kimmel shot back, his own voice rising to match Ford's intensity. "Because last I checked, your last few movies were box office disasters. Maybe instead of preaching about the environment, you should focus on making movies people actually want to see." The personal attack on his recent work was devastating, and everyone in the studio could see it hit Ford like a physical blow. His recent films had indeed underperformed at the box office, a fact that had been weighing heavily on the veteran actor. But hearing it thrown in his face so cruelly, in front of a live audience and television cameras, was almost unbearable. Ford's voice dropped to a whisper that was somehow more terrifying than his earlier shouting. "You have absolutely no idea what you're talking about. You've never created anything meaningful in your entire career. You're nothing but a parasite, feeding off the accomplishments and failures of others. You contribute nothing to this world except cynicism and cheap cruelty." The production team was now in full panic mode. The show's director was frantically signaling to cut to commercial, but the confrontation was happening so fast and so intensely that no one seemed to know how to intervene. This was live television at its most raw and unpredictable. Kimmel, realizing he had perhaps pushed too far but unable to back down without losing face, decided to go for the nuclear option. "At least I'm not desperately clinging to characters I played 40 years ago. Face it, Harrison. Without Han Solo and Indiana Jones, you're just another angry old man yelling at clouds. Maybe it's time to accept that your moment has passed." The reference to his most beloved characters was the cruelest cut of all. Ford had spent decades trying to distance himself from being defined solely by those roles, even famously advocating for Han Solo's death in the Star Wars films. To have them thrown back at him as evidence of his irrelevance was both deeply personal and professionally devastating. Ford stepped closer to Kimmel's desk, his presence now genuinely intimidating. "You want to see an angry old man, Jimmy? Keep talking. Because I've had enough of your disrespect, your arrogance, and your complete lack of professionalism. This interview is over." But as Ford turned to leave, Kimmel couldn't resist one final devastating blow that would push the confrontation into territory from which there could be no recovery. "Running away, Harrison," Kimmel called out, his voice dripping with contempt. "I guess that's what you do best these days. Run away from tough questions. Run away from your failures. And run away from the fact that you're nothing more than a has-been desperately trying to buy relevance with environmental virtue signaling. Maybe if you spent less time lecturing people and more time actually acting, your career wouldn't be in the toilet." Ford froze mid-step, his back still turned to Kimmel. The entire studio held its breath as the legendary actor slowly turned around, his face now a mask of cold fury that was somehow more terrifying than any of his previous outbursts. The transformation was complete. This was no longer Harrison Ford the movie star, but something primal and dangerous. "What did you just say?" Ford's voice was barely audible, but it carried through the silent studio like a death sentence. Every person in that room could feel the electricity in the air, the sense that they were witnessing something that would be talked about for years to come. Kimmel, either oblivious to the danger or too committed to his path of destruction, to care, pressed on with reckless abandon. "You heard me. You're a washed-up actor hiding behind environmental causes because you can't accept that Hollywood has moved on without you. Your last 3 movies were flops. Your upcoming projects are jokes, and everyone in this town knows it. You're yesterday's news trying to stay relevant by playing the wise old sage, but we all see through it." The cruelty of the attack was breathtaking in its completeness. Kimmel had systematically destroyed Ford's professional legacy, personal convictions, and current relevance in a matter of seconds. But what he didn't anticipate was that he had just awakened something in Ford that Hollywood hadn't seen in decades. Ford walked back toward the desk with the measured pace of a predator stalking its prey. "You want to know about failure, Jimmy? Let me tell you about real failure. Real failure is having a platform to make a difference and choosing instead to tear people down for cheap entertainment. Real failure is being given the opportunity to elevate discourse and choosing instead to wallow in the gutter. Real failure is being so insecure about your own limitations that you have to attack others to feel powerful." Each word was delivered with surgical precision, designed to cut deep. Ford had spent decades observing people, studying human nature for his craft, and now he was using every bit of that knowledge to dismantle Kimmel piece by piece. "But you know what the real tragedy is?" Ford continued, now standing directly in front of Kimmel's desk, towering over the seated host. "You actually had talent once. I've seen your early work. You were funny, you were clever, you had timing. But somewhere along the way, you decided that cruelty was easier than creativity. You chose to become exactly the kind of person that comedy should be fighting against, not celebrating." Kimmel's face had gone pale. For the first time since the confrontation began, he seemed to realize that he had made a catastrophic miscalculation. Ford wasn't just angry. He was disappointed, and somehow that was infinitely worse. "I've worked with real comedians, Jimmy. I've worked with people who understood that comedy should punch up, not down. People who knew that making others laugh didn't require making them cry. You've turned this show into a coliseum where you feed guests to the lions for sport, and you've convinced yourself that makes you clever." The audience was transfixed, watching as one of Hollywood's most respected figures delivered what amounted to a masterclass in controlled devastation. This wasn't just an angry outburst. This was a veteran performer at the peak of his powers, using every tool in his arsenal to completely dismantle his opponent. Ford placed both hands on Kimmel's desk and leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried more weight than any shout. "You want to know why my recent movies didn't perform well at the box office? Because I chose to work with filmmakers who had something important to say, rather than just something profitable to sell. I chose substance over success, integrity over income. Can you say the same?" Kimmel tried to respond, but Ford wasn't finished. "And you know what's really pathetic? You think attacking me somehow elevates you. But all you've done tonight is show everyone watching exactly who you really are. A small, bitter man who mistakes cruelty for courage and thinks that tearing others down somehow builds himself up." The host attempted to regain control, stammering, "Harrison, I think you're overreacting." "Overreacting?" Ford's voice exploded with such force that Kimmel actually recoiled in his chair. "You ambush me on your show, attack my character, mock my convictions, insult my career, and then tell me I'm overreacting? This is exactly the kind of gaslighting behavior that people are finally getting tired of. You create the problem and then blame others for responding to it." Ford straightened up, his decision clearly made. "I came here tonight in good faith. Jimmy, I believe that despite your reputation, we could have a meaningful conversation about issues that matter. But instead, you've shown me, and everyone watching, exactly why this show and hosts like you are becoming irrelevant." The actor began removing his microphone, his movements deliberate and final. "You know what the difference is between us, Jimmy? When my movies fail, I take responsibility and try to do better. When your show fails, and it is failing, you blame everyone else and double down on the behavior that's driving people away." Kimmel made one last desperate attempt to salvage the situation. "Come on, Harrison, this is just entertainment. Don't take it so personally." Ford paused in his departure, turning back one final time with a look of absolute contempt. "Just entertainment? You just spent 20 minutes systematically attacking everything I care about, everything I've worked for, and everything I believe in. And you call it entertainment? This is exactly the problem. You think cruelty is entertainment. You think humiliation is humor. Well, congratulations, Jimmy. You've just entertained yourself right out of a guest, and your audience out of any respect they might have had for you. With that, Harrison Ford dropped his microphone onto Kimmel's desk with a decisive thud that echoed through the silent studio like a gunshot. He turned toward the audience, gave them a respectful nod that acknowledged their unfortunate position as witnesses to this debacle, and walked off the stage with the dignity and grace that had defined his entire career. The studio remained in the stunned silence as Ford disappeared into the wings, leaving Kimmel sitting alone at his desk, looking smaller and more defeated than anyone had ever seen him. The cameras continued rolling, capturing the host's obvious distress and the palpable discomfort of everyone in the room. What had started as a routine promotional interview had become a devastating exposé of everything wrong with modern celebrity culture and media. Ford hadn't just walked off a talk show. He had delivered a masterclass in dignity under fire and shown the world what it looked like when someone finally said, "Enough," to the culture of manufactured controversy and cheap cruelty that had infected entertainment. As the credits finally rolled on what would become the most talked-about late-night television moment in decades, one thing was crystal clear. Harrison Ford had reminded everyone why he was a legend, while Jimmy Kimmel had shown exactly why his approach to hosting was rapidly becoming a relic of a bygone era.